my gratitude for your participation in this roundtable. Before we commence, let me introduce myself. This is my first time actually chairing the G24 meetings. My name is Adrian Cabiles. I am the chair of the Washington-based bureau of the G24, as well as the alternate executive director for the EDS 15 constituency of the World Bank Group. I'm representing the constituencies of Brazil, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Haiti, Panama, the Philippines, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago. It is a great honor to chair today's roundtable with the theme of reforming the multilateral development banks for the challenges of the 21st century. Over the past couple of years, initiatives aimed at reforming the multilateral development banks gathered momentum as it became more and more apparent that their vision, operations, and financial models have not evolved commensurately with the scale of challenges confronting the world. It has been a month since the annual meeting of the World Bank IMF closed, and as we know, a number of landmark agreements has been reached, such as the IMF members' pledge to increase quota contributions, the new vision statement of the World Bank incorporating livable planet and the use of hybrid capital and portfolio guarantees to expand lending capacity, among others. There have also been changes on how the bank operates with its clients as well as how it engages its partners. Since Marrakesh, many of us have burning questions. We ask what would be the next steps and follow-throughs that could be expected after the agreements. We also ask how responsive these moves could be in our current situation of weak expected growth, constrained fiscal resources and financing windows, increased debt, and worsening geopolitical tensions. Most importantly, we ask what would be the implications of these changes to our respective countries. A good number of us, for example, would want to see how impacts of the evolution of Mdbs will be measured to ensure that they yield the intended purpose, or that many of us are particularly concerned, for example, on how the continued discussion on concessionality, preferencing, and global challenges as part of the World Bank's evolution process would affect our access to financing in our current situation, amid our current situation of uncertainty, volatility, and vulnerability. So today's roundtable provides us the venue to discuss these issues. We are joined today by a lineup of well-respected and accomplished resource persons to share their views on the MDB evolution post-Marrakesh. We hope that today's discussions could provide us with some ideas on what may be the directions to take the MDB evolution further, as it gains momentum, and how we would take advantage of these changes among our development partners. So thank you once again for joining us, and we hope that you will find today's roundtable helpful and insightful. I now turn over to Iyabo to moderate these sessions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil. And once again, thank you very much to our distinguished panelists for honoring our invitation to take part in this policy roundtable. We did indicate at the beginning point that this session is going to be recorded and will be publicized, as is usually the case with G24 events. We've structured it around 4 panels. The lead speaker is expected to provide some context to the issues regarding what the issues really are, what are the progress over the past years, and what was achieved during the annual meetings, and what should be the priority areas going forward, what should be on our to-do list as we see how events unfold in the reform agenda. We encourage members, participants to use the chat box as much as possible for the Q&A. The Q&As will take place after every 2 panels. And for those who want to intervene then they also have the opportunity to do so during the Q&A. So having said that, let me now start off with the first panel. The first panel is on the capital adequacy framework of the Mdbs, the reforms of the capital adequacy framework of the Mdbs. And our lead speaker is Chris Humphrey, who is a senior research associate at the ODI and also a member of the G20 expert panel on reform of the capital adequacy framework of Mdbs. Nancy Lee is the director of Sustainable Development Finance and Senior Policy Fellow at the CGD, the Center for Global Development. She was also a member of the expert panel on capital adequacy framework. Otaviano Canuto, a non-resident fellow, senior fellow at Brookings Institution and former vice president, World Bank and IDB, and also a former executive director of the IMF, is also one of our speakers today. And they will all together be able to answer the questions we have and provide us some context going forward. So, Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Iyabo, and thanks also to Neil and the rest of the G24 team for putting together quite an impressive lineup of speakers today. As Iyabo mentioned, I'm going to touch on capital adequacy agenda. And I think I'll start off with three messages for you today. The first is that we have made some decent progress on reforming MDB capital adequacy since the CAF report came out in 2021, but that we still have a lot more to do. Second, in my view, we need to move beyond thinking about whether this or that recommendation gets us this or that many billions, and rather focus on modernizing MDB capital adequacy in a holistic way that the CAF report proposed, and that takes patience and collective action. And third, the risks involved in doing so are very low, and the potential upside is very high in the many hundreds of billions of dollars of additional lending, as well as in clarifying the discussions about MDB capacity and capital needs. So it is well worth pushing ahead. Most of what's been done so far are financial innovations like portfolio guarantees and hybrid capital instruments, which are great, although they do have some trade-offs that, in my view, need to be closely looked at. I actually just wrote a paper on hybrid capital instruments and MDBs, which the audience might find of interest at ODI. But the core agenda really is capital adequacy itself, which is just a ratio at the end of the day. How much capital is adequate to cover the risks of an MDB? And commercial banks have a set of standards by the Basel Committee and national banking regulators that provide a clear orientation to rating agencies, to investors, to management, to shareholders. And MDBs don't have these standards. There's no regulator. There's no Basel III for MDBs. So nobody has a real clear answer on how much capital is adequate. And frankly, that's kind of an absurd situation. These are the most important development finance institutions in the planet, and we need to better understand what they can do. And we can fix it. Doing so involves the MDBs working together collectively. Collectively is a word I'm going to use a lot in this talk because I think that's critical. And with the active backing of shareholders, including borrowers and non-borrowers, to help define standards for this unique sector in a way that's going to be credible to the markets. The CAF panel pointed the way, but could not by itself establish these standards. We were an independent panel. We didn't have all the data, the analytical capacity, or frankly, the official standing to be able to move markets. That has to come from the MDBs and the shareholders working together collectively. For example, a key question for deciding how much capital an MDB needs is how risky are its loans? And as we all know, public sector MDBs basically always get repaid. That's preferred creditor treatment. That should mean that MDBs need a lot less capital to back up their loans compared to a commercial bank. But rating agencies and MDBs all take PCT into account in very different ways, and not nearly to the extent that evidence would seem to indicate would be appropriate. And if they were to do so, that could have a huge impact on how much lending an MDB can do. So how do we fix that? We organize a cross-MDB working group where the MDBs pool their own internal data and have MDB staff work together to analyze in a systematic and serious way how PCT has impacted the performance of their loan portfolios. Use the results of that to come up with sensible, prudent ways to incorporate PCT into their adequacy frameworks in line with the evidence. And then you share these results with the rating agencies. That's how you influence their methodologies. The agencies have said very clearly that they're open to looking at evidence, and the MDBs need to give it to them. Callable capital is another area that's unique to MDBs. It's this odd sort of guarantee with a huge nominal value, hundreds of billions of dollars. But MDBs and shareholders sort of try to pretend that it's not really there. They don't like to talk about it, while the rating agencies give wildly different values for it in their methodologies. And we need some basic standards to understand how to value this instrument. I'm leading a project on this myself. I'm happy to talk more about it. And there's also an initiative underway led by some shareholders and MDBs, which in my view is a step in the right direction. More work needs to be done also on other issues like concentration risk, which is very important, especially for the regional MDBs, and on standardizing these innovations that I mentioned earlier, like hybrids and securitizations and risk transfers, to understand how they fit strategically into capital management of an MDB rather than just sort of opportunistically grabbing a few billion here or there. I wish it was 100 billion. So this is about increasing lending capacity for sure, but it's also about providing clarity to the shareholders like you, to MDB management and to market actors to better understand how MDBs, how much they can prudently lend and when they might need more capital. I know there's some very legitimate concerns amongst shareholders, and maybe one of the top ones amongst these that MDBs are going to lose their AAA, and that will increase loan pricing. That risk is negligible. The CAF report is not suggesting that MDBs risk losing their AAA. Rather, it tries to find ways to redefine what AAA is for an MDB by establishing evidence-based standards that all stakeholders understand and that rating agencies will react to. And if it appears that a rating agency might be moving towards a downgrade, then the MDB simply dial back lending, which is exactly what they do now. So there's no additional danger of a downgrade by going ahead with this agenda. And in fact, if we were to standardize the innovations that were part of the CAF report, MDBs are going to be even more resilient to the risk of a downgrade. Because if a crisis hits, they can respond by quickly deploying a hybrid or a portfolio guarantee to deal with an emergency, because they're on the shelf, standardized, ready to go, rather than having to wait for support from shareholders. I realize there's a lot of politics wrapped up into this, particularly related to capital increase discussions, which I think perhaps my colleague Nancy Lee may touch upon afterwards. But the capital adequacy agenda benefits everybody because it's in everyone's interest for their capital to work harder. So I would very much encourage you to support this agenda, including by linking it to issues related to G24 membership concerns, like shareholding, for example, or net income policy, which I'm always a bit surprised borrowers don't push on a little bit harder, or some of the other operational issues that I think will be touched upon later in the discussion today. And I'm happy to discuss this in any more detail, but I hope this has been interesting, and I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And that was quite a layout of most of the issues. I hope that in the next round, we will hear more about the credit rating agencies. There's a lot of concern that the pace of reforms in different areas, in particular for the credit rating agencies, has not progressed as much as things like optimizing the balance sheet of the banks. So can I now call on Nancy Lee to give her statement? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Iyabo, and I'm really happy to have this opportunity to take stock of CAF reform progress, particularly on the same panel with my highly esteemed co-panel member in the issuance of our 2022 report. It's particularly good to be able to have this conversation because, to be honest, when the original report was issued in July of 2022, the reaction, particularly by the MDBs, was not uniformly positive by any means. Most indicated publicly or privately that the proposed reforms were ill-advised, impractical, imprudent, and even in some cases, reckless. We've really seen a pretty dramatic shift. Now we can say that nearly all of the CAF reforms are on the agenda at some stage for all of the major institutions. And I credit the unified and resolute stance of shareholders in this regard. From what we can see on the outside, both borrowing and non-borrowing shareholders sent a clear message that given the urgent and escalating shocks and the scale of the needs, using capital more efficiently while maintaining ratings, as Chris was describing, has to be an immediate priority. And the relative speed of most CAF reforms is really one of their important advantages in comparison to the time needed to negotiate things like capital increases. And as recently as Marrakesh, we saw the Mdbs signaling that they have gotten the message, the Mdb heads. They project that CAF measures could potentially yield additional lending headroom of 300 to 400 billion over the next decade. And as Chris said, it's not all about lending capacity, but 300 to 400 billion is certainly not trivial, and it corresponds to what we said in the report, which was that these reforms could yield hundreds of billions of dollars of additional headroom. So the threefold challenge ahead, though, will be to number one, follow through with execution. And there's a long way to go on that, as I'll discuss. Number two, keep the focus on reforms where shareholders and risk departments have to exert themselves to analyze risks carefully and make the right decisions on managing that risk. And I'm speaking here in particular about callable capital. And then finally, keep attention on the credit rating agencies, as Chris was mentioning, so that they follow through, because they have stated their openness to adjusting and improving their methodologies as more risk data and evidence becomes available. So I'll just discuss three things to complement what Chris said. First, overall CAF reform progress, to give you a sense of what's moving and what's not moving. I want to highlight a few reforms that are really at risk of falling off the table unless there's more attention and action. And I want to talk about the relationship between CAF reforms and general capital increases. So CGD has just, launched in October, something we call the Mdb Reform Tracker. It monitors progress across a whole range of Mdb reform agendas, including CAF reforms, across the 6 biggest multilateral development banks. Reform progress is scored in 3 ways. Either reforms have been acted upon or action is imminent, reforms are under consideration, or reforms are not under consideration. So it's sort of a 3-part scoring. The tracker shows that all CAF reforms have been taken up by at least one institution, demonstrating their feasibility. But the extent of progress is very uneven. We see the most progress, including implementation, for deploying donor guarantees of portfolios of Mdb loans to shift risk off their balance sheets and free up capital. That's not surprising, and I would say that's where the Mdbs are most enthusiastic, because more headroom by offloading risk to donor balance sheets is kind of an attractive proposition for them. Next, scaling portfolio risk transfers and issuing hybrid capital are the other areas where we see most Mdbs moving forward, led, I have to acknowledge, by the pioneering efforts of the African development banks. We see the least progress in the recommendation to have shareholders define risk appetites and to account adequately for preferred creditor treatment, where only 1 to 2 of those 6 institutions have made progress. And for giving value to callable capital, only 2 banks have actually taken action in their capital adequacy policy decisions forward, and which have not. And I said that hybrid capital and guarantees and the headroom being created by those initiatives are moving forward. And I was saying where we see the least progress.
Yes.
So the least progress are in those recommendations in the CAF report where shareholders have to define risk appetites as part of the capital adequacy policy and framework, and to account adequately and accurately for preferred creditor treatment in CAF frameworks and policies. Only 1 to 2 institutions have made progress, and I'm using now what I was describing as the CGD MDB reform tracker to make these assessments. So please, everybody, feel free to go online and check out that reform tracker, which we are going to update periodically. For callable capital, only 2 banks have actually taken action, while 1 more is taking partial action. So only half of the sample of MDBs. We don't see evidence that credit rating agencies have acted to change their methodologies yet. So I really agree with the emphasis that Chris Humphrey put on keeping the focus on credit rating agencies to do what they said they would do, which is to adjust those methodologies as they get more evidence. Despite some suggestions by some institutions that they've done all they can on CAF reform, there is in fact a long way to go. And when you hear those conclusions, I would urge you to be skeptical. So let me just mention 2 reforms that are really at risk of falling off the table. One, it has to do with the recommendation to have an annual joint MDB report that benchmarks capital adequacy across institutions based on the same methodology and the same indicators. This is a basic tool to enable shareholders to make consistent and objective decisions about when general capital increases are needed. It's in fact remarkable that such benchmarking does not now exist. It would not be at all difficult for MDBs to produce such a report. They have all the data. They just don't present the data now using the same definitions and ratios. And because they don't do so, it's really impossible for shareholders to make such comparisons consistently across institutions. Second, the report recommends periodic capital reviews in all the major institutions at some reasonable interval, perhaps 5 years, again, using comparable methodologies and data. If such reviews were a regular, well-grounded part of shareholder governance, as they should be, it would take some of the very difficult politics and perhaps even caprice and arbitrariness of decisions to pursue capital increase, which we certainly see on the landscape at this moment. And there are precedents for such regular reviews. We have only to look at the 3-year IDA replenishment cycle, which offers an opportunity not only to make resource decisions, but also to make operational and policy reforms that address evolving needs. Finally, this question of the relationship between CAF reforms and general capital increases. The report makes clear that CAF reforms should complement, not substitute, for general capital increases. And all of us on the panel, I could say, were quite united and quite firm on that point. Since then, the report of the independent experts group to the G20 demonstrates and quantifies that point. As you probably know, the report proposes a tripling of collective MDB non-concessional lending capacity to $300 billion a year by 2030, so that MDBs can play the role they need to play in mobilizing the additional $1 trillion in external financing needed for SDG and GPG finance. So of that $300 billion, $200 billion has to be additional on top of the baseline figure of $100 billion. And the report offers a plausible scenario for how to get to that number. It shows, or it suggests, that $80 billion of the additional lending capacity, annual lending capacity, could come from CAF reforms, which is not an inconsiderable amount. But that still leaves a major gap. And the report reckons that 100 billion of that gap must be filled by capital increases and retained earnings. I would just observe, far from being shocked by how large that number is, this is now the number for the entire MDB system, I would submit one should be shocked at how small it is. And that's, of course, because the MDB financial model offers very efficient lending capacity from very small amounts of paid-in capital. In the case of the IBRD, the paid-in capital increases would be 25 billion for all shareholders, and that would be paid in over 5 years for 5 billion a year for all shareholders combined. So to end, neither the logic nor the numbers support the notion that CAF reforms and general capital increases are substitutes. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Yes, we're obviously behind time. We started late and also the technical glitch. So I will call on Otaviano to make his intervention now. I think we may be able to catch up within the time frame we have set later in the presentations, but I do request that speakers exercise patience and stay with us till the end. Otaviano.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Iyabo. It's really a pleasure to be here, an honor, and with such a great company. I will be able to be brief because, in fact, both Chris and Nancy, framed out the basic and most important questions in this discussion. And I also want to join many for thanking both Chris and Nancy for their contribution through the CAF report, which has been, let's say, a public good that has been produced by the team and a quite important one for us. Just a couple of points, just to reinforce what has been said on what Chris said about a need to have, if not a Basel III kind of regulation, but let's say the establishment of a common framework discussed among multilateral development banks to serve as a benchmark that might, let's say, reinforce, illuminate the perspective on all the more doubtful issues of the agenda. And this would come, we cannot underestimate the relevance of such a really multilateral effort, particularly in a context in which more recently we have had this proliferation of institutions. And even though I myself witnessed moments of cooperation among these institutions in my times, the last time I'm referring to this was in Manila, on a project on sanitation by the financed by the World Bank, where the AIIB knocked on the door and asked it to join it, and it was a triple win for both institutions and also for the Philippines. And so the more cooperation we have, the more let's say convergence in that regard, the better for all of us and for the institutions. So an effort or an invitation in an attempt to establish some sort of a common framework would be good for all of us and all the multilateral institutions. So this point is important enough to be emphasized. Second point, the eternal doubt about the weights of the preferred creditor status versus the callable capital. I remember my times when a question was asked to rating agencies, and they didn't give us any clear response. They said both mattered, and of course at the time among my roles, I was in the place in the constituency where exactly Neil is now, and as representing middle-income countries, we wanted to highlight the relevance, the weight of the preferred creditor status vis-a-vis the callable capital, but the rating agencies did not give us a clear response in that regard. But anyway, the still is there, and we should keep it on. And by the way, to the extent of possible, I've been accompanying what rating agencies have said. More recently, I read a reasonably upbeat assessment by Moody's by saying that recognizing first that, as Nancy described quite well, some Mdbs have already taken big strides to implement the G20's recommendation, as the case of the IBRD, that's the case as well of the Asian Development Bank. The African Development Bank has announced a hybrid capital transaction and so on. And what matters most is, as Moody recognizing that higher lending is unlikely to have, their words, significant credit implications if compensated by other measures. And that leverage will likely rise under these proposals, among other reasons, because the Mdbs suggest that the higher lending multipliers for the hybrid facilities are clear relative to the current leverage. And so the point, at least the signal, is favorable in the sense that, particularly if the whole range of reforms, the progress of which has been uneven, as well said by Nancy, we may have, let's say, the expected result of higher leverage without any credit implication for the institutions. Probably the toughest component to obtain progress on will be relative to the recognized the acknowledgement of the callable capital and the shareholders' reaction. And finally, just to conclude, of course, just to reemphasize, as Nancy aptly said, that we will definitely need, beyond the capital adequacy revisit, we will need a general capital increase. One is not a substitute to the other. But thank you very much, and thank you both, Chris and Nancy, for what you have done. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Otaviano. And that concludes the first panel. I think we should move quickly to the next panel, which is on the triple agenda and the World Bank evolution reform. Our speakers for this panel are Annalisa Prizzon, who is a principal research fellow at ODI and also a member of the technical team of the G20 Independent Expert Group on MDM reforms that authored the triple agenda. Marilou, who is a senior fellow at the GDP Center, Boston University, and my immediate predecessor in this position. And Daouda Sembene, distinguished non-resident fellow at Center for Global Development. So I now call on Annalisa to lay out the context and take on the mic, as it were. Okay.
Fantastic. Iyabo, thank you so much for the invitation. Delighted to see many friends on the call. And also I would like to acknowledge Nancy Lee as well, was in the technical core team behind the G20 Independent Expert Group on strengthening Mdbs. Let me try and tackle very briefly all the 4 questions that were raised for this session. The ambitiousness of the triple agenda, the contribution of the capital increases, already Nancy's touched upon this, the scaling up of concessional finance and the prospects for Mdbs working as a system. All of that within the 5 minutes of being allocated. But my first kind of point, reading through the concept note for today's discussion, that was actually the first time when I read that the triple agenda wasn't ambitious enough. Actually, we tried to kind of acknowledge that this is not an ambitious agenda. This is what it's kind of needed. And also I would like to kind of stress how the triple agenda, I'm talking about the bigger banks, is about the role that Mdbs should play within the 3 trillion needed for climate action and SDGs in developing countries other than China. There's a recognition, and I want to be clear, that financing, and partly Nancy has alluded to that earlier on, has to come from domestic resources, private finance and their balance with official development finance will change across countries. You might expect that in upper middle income countries, the ability to mobilize domestic finance might be way greater than lower income countries. The next session will talk about private sector mobilization, so I'm not touching on this, and also resources will have to come directly from bilateral donors and other multilateral organizations. But it's worth stressing that MDBs will play a central role in mobilizing finance for climate action as the SDGs, and also thanks to their leverage effect, but they are part of a kind of a broad development finance architecture. Which leads me to the second point. I mean, in terms of the triple agenda of MDBs, as Nancy has already alluded to, it is about how MDBs can reach 390 billion each year by 2030, tripling the current finances. On the non-concessional finance, tripling means increasing MDB non-concessional lending by 200 billion each year by 2030, as Nancy mentioned. But I would like to reiterate, CAF measures and innovative finance, this is a very important point that we just discussed, are important, but the heavy lift will come from fresh injection of resources. We know that the MDBs are at different kind of degrees of lending headroom, and capital increases will be needed in different ways across MDBs. Probably I'm still kind of biased, but I would like to stress the point that Nancy made earlier on. The resources of paid-in capital are very small vis-a-vis the ability of mobilizing additional lending. A statistic that Chris and I love kind of citing, I mean, since the establishment of the World Bank, the paid-in capital had been able to generate more than 40 times lending from the World Bank. And at times when, I mean, many kind of governments are trying to balance the books, investing in fresh resources for the MDBs represents really good value for money. On the concessional side, the tripling means increasing by 60 billion each year by 2030. We know that concessional finance is a scarce resource, but I have to mention this in the intervention as my third point, as we're starting the IDA 21 replenishment process in the next 3 weeks. It is worth reminding that donor contributions have stayed stable over the past couple of replenishments, around 23 billion, but they fell by 25% in real terms since 2009, that's IDA 15. So restoring that kind of volume should be a kind of a priority for the next replenishment as a minimum kind of element. And let me go to my fourth and final point, which is around the prospects for MDBs working as a system. As I said, there are a number of kind of positive signals and a different direction of travel. I mean, Nancy earlier on has mentioned the statement, the joint statement of the MDB heads. This is actually the first ever statement that the MDB presidents put together. And we also need to remind the MOU between the IDB and the World Bank, which is unprecedented on a programmatic level, and the joint visit between President Banga and President Goldfein to Peru and Jamaica earlier on. So certainly some progress on this kind of agenda, but for MDBs to be better and bolder, that's the other kind of component together with bigger MDBs. Actually, they need to work together much better as a system. And Chris earlier on kind of mentioned the word collectively. I won't touch upon the kind of the CAF measures. We know that colleagues across MDBs do work together. There are many examples that many of you can cite, but this is based on individuals rather than kind of systematically embedded in the structure of MDBs. We know that working together is more complicated. It takes time. There are a number of transaction costs, but also many of you from Capitals are perfectly aware of the different processes, standards that MDBs have that put really pressure on your back offices dealing with all the MDBs and contracts you need to put together. So to a certain extent, the harmonization, convergence of standards should be a priority, but also catalyzing MDB efforts through country-led and country-owned platforms. That's a very kind of important point that was stressed within the IEG report. And of course, there should be greater incentives to work together. This should be from management, particularly to create incentives for career progression that takes into account collaboration between MDBs, but also pressure from shareholders to make this agenda happen and make it a kind of a priority. And I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. And now I will call on Marilou to intervene.
Let me just,
Yes, Marilou, yes.
Sorry, you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Well, thanks very much, Iyabo and colleagues, for the kind invitation. It's a real pleasure to be with our colleagues, the panelists today, almost all familiar faces. So the main question posed, to paraphrase, is whether the triple agenda will result in an MDB that is fit for purpose for the 21st century. Will it bring enough scale, which I thought, like Annalisa, was a surprising question, and why and or why not? So let me offer 4 broad comments from an old hand of the G24. So first, on the ambition of the triple agenda, an important methodological strength of the triple agenda is its use of what they call a deductive approach. So it used projected estimates of financing needs for the years to come, which were based on a long-standing body of work on the area, and then worked backwards, and deduced what might be the role of MDBs. This seems sensible to future size a development institution, especially if you want a real step up in its role, which is the case when you add the enormous climate financing needs on top of long-standing development assistance. So the MDB's lending volume path, as many of you know, has historically been based on a rather organic growth, with occasional uptick from intermittent capital increases or from drops after a crisis abates. I'm sorry, this is familiarity from somebody who has been in the bank for a long time. So sizing the bank based on development climate financing needs is quite appropriate and definitely ambitious if it is to evolve to respond much better to higher levels of financing needs in the future. Now, what struck me more as a question is what assumption was made regarding the absorptive capacity in countries to expand their investments. As many of you know, country programs do not scale up quickly for many reasons. Perhaps a better and a faster bank will be easier to deal with and will help client countries expand lending easily or expand borrowing more easily than before. But it will be worthwhile to have more discussions on what should change in the way MDBs work with countries in order to play a more supportive role to build such capacity. Now, second, an important takeaway, which I hope you will agree with, and at which Annalisa pointed out, is the emphasis on both concessional and non-concessional financing. The triple agenda starts with the MDBs expecting to deliver 260 billion of annual investment financing, 60 billion from concessional, 180 billion from non-concessional window. So stretching and enhancing capital for development financing is not only about, let's say in the World Bank, about IBRD and non-concessional lending headrooms. So it's also about how best to increase IDA, not only to enhance lending volumes, but also to preserve deep levels of concessionality when needed. It is notable, for example, that IDA has provided more grants since 2020, particularly to borrowers who fall into debt distress. And this is a core part of IDA's concessional framework, which I hope will be preserved. So my advice then for G24 going forward is to hold the MDBs accountable, particularly the World Bank for the G24, to enhancing both concessional and non-concessional financing to increase the lending to a diverse range of low and middle income countries. And beyond scale, greater ambition could be given to improving financing terms. And I know that there is some internal discussion around it, at least within the World Bank. Without going into details, key areas are managing foreign exchange risks, truly mainstreaming state contingent instruments, and possibly extending maturities. These will matter quite significantly to improve affordability of financing for many developing countries. Now, third, on the ambition of the scale of concessional financing. Again, let me pick up where Annalisa left off. The report seeks to triple IDA's annual lending by 2030. This is critical if you actually assume that climate financing will significantly increase and if typical lending, regular lending to low-income countries will also grow given the development financing needs in low-income countries. And if you assume that more grant lending will persist as countries stay in debt distress for some period of time, and that the concessional framework is preserved. So, but that said, my main concern here is the realism of that ask. This will require significantly increasing donor replenishments, which, according to Annalisa, was constant, but which I would say was stagnant, if not declining. And increasing donor replenishments will require a major reversal in that trend of the past few years. No, actually, it's more like a past decade. Now, as Annalisa said, the modest goal here is the replenishment of the IDA crisis window this year. Now, doing much more than that within a few years will be a major ask. The question is what will happen to IDA's future if this does not materialize? Are there other options to increase the volume of concessional financing within an NDB like the World Bank? Now, fourth and lastly, I do agree with the view that a capital increase for MDBs will be needed to significantly increase its lending headroom. Hybrid and other innovative instruments to stretch balance sheets of MDBs are very promising instruments. And as a previous staff member, it is about time they are explored seriously, at least in the World Bank Group. Now, eventually, though, there is a limit to using hybrid capital. At least for me, there's a binding constraint. I believe it can be at most 15% of the existing capital base of MDBs, which is not much. There's also a limit to the use of bilateral guarantees, or even recycled SDRs for hybrid capital, if ever that happens. So ultimately, a general capital increase will be needed to meet the ambitious lending goal. The process of a capital increase will be complex, as you all know. Now, the consensus has to be reached not only on the volume of the increase, which, as many of you say, is not a lot, but more so on the difficult changes to the shareholding structures of MDBs. Note the World Bank Group, and note what has happened to the recent quota review in the IMF, where there was an increase in quotas resources, but no realignment of quota shares. Now, realignment in MDBs will be critical to ensure adequate representation of developing countries and will determine the legitimacy of MDBs eventually. So my advice is to start the discussions of a prospective capital increase as soon as you can. Plan on at least 3 years, or maybe 2 years of consultations, of intensive consultations, and plan for the best, but expect the worst, in which case there will be no realignment of shareholding in MDBs. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marilou. And 3 years is really about the kind of estimates we've had from different fora on what kind of timeline we should expect for capital increase. Now, I call on Daouda Sembene to speak next. And so far, we do not have any questions. So we may be able to move on to the third panel and take the questions at the end of the presentations. Thank you. Daouda.
Thank you very much, Iyabo, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you, especially along with for some colleagues and former old friends like Chris Humphrey, whom I know for 20 years now. I think we were asked 3 questions, and we were asked to respond within 5 minutes. So I think it's going to be easy for me because most of these questions have been already addressed by previous speakers, including the fact whether the triple agenda is ambitious enough. I believe Annalisa and Marilou has really done a great job in responding to that question. I would focus mainly on the two other questions, which is whether there is any role for SDRs in mobilizing incremental and affordable financing for IDA and IBRD under the triple agenda. I think if you read the report, it of course acknowledges that there is a role for the special drawing rights to play in mobilizing such financing. I think what the high-level experts are proposing is, of course, to do what the AFDB, the African Development Bank, is already doing, which is try to issue hybrid capitals using SDRs. And this is certainly something that needs to be done and done as quickly as possible, because it has a huge potential in helping MDBs raise more funding or financing and boost their financing, their lending capacity. The question is not whether that can be done, but I think everyone knows that this can be done because the AFDB has really set forth a very innovative and strong proposal for using SDRs as a hybrid capital. The question is how you can mobilize the political commitment that is needed for that. It's been 2 years since the AFDB has come up with that proposal, and until now we are talking about whether they can raise the resources that is associated with that proposal. And it's not really a big amount of money. We are talking about 2.5 billion, which is not really much compared to the 650 billion of worth of SDRs that the IMF has issued, of which more than 440 billion went to G20 countries. So I think this is more an issue about how you can garner the political commitment that is needed to make it happen. And if we do so, I believe we can actually find the opportunity to raise a lot of resources for MDBs to really be able to achieve the tripling of the financing that triple agenda is proposing. So that's one. The second question I wanted to respond more based on my experience as a former IMF executive director has to do with what are the prospects for MDBs to work as a system. First of all, it has to be recognized that this is not new. I think this recommendation has been made back in April 2017 when the G20 Eminent Persons Group on Global Financial Governance actually made this recommendation. Since then, since then there has been some progress made. I think in recent years and more, we have seen some head of MDBs getting together and signaling their intent to work together. But I think there is so much scope for doing much more than these MDBs have been doing so far. I think before I talked about our experience at the time when I was at the IMF, there are some interesting suggestions from the report that needs to really move forward with. One of them is how you can push MDB to work together to develop project pipelines and share costs. I think this is something that would be very much needed, and that would not be sort of new because it's already done in the context of the global infrastructure facility. Another proposal made by the triple agenda is to have MDB approach credit rating agencies as a group. This could be a game changer, because so long as MDB would approach these credit rating agencies individually, chances are they would not really very much succeed in implementing those proposals that Chris, Nancy, and other members of the CAF panel expert did recommend, which is actually to push them to give value to the callable capital. So I think there is really some urgency in really pushing MDBs to work together and engage as a group the credit rating agencies. That would be the only way they could really have some meaningful impact on making sure that there is some progress on that. And I think one issue that, and I would end there, that is very much critical is for MDBs to work as a system, there needs to be the shareholders to play a big role. I think Annalisa mentioned that, and I would actually repeat that based on my experience. When I was IMF Executive Director, I was privileged to be the head of the committee that was tasked with collaboration with other multilateral institutions, including the World Bank and the UN and the WTO. What I noticed then was that it was very much actually up to the membership, up to the capitals to really push management of those institutions to really engage and really be able to push the collaboration agenda forward. So long as you don't do it, it would depend on the personalities. We have seen what happened before at the World Bank and the IMF. So long as some head of, some president of the World Bank or managing director at the IMF are left alone with defining how to push the collaboration with other institutions, chances are they would only do it if they do have some sort of, with those institutions with which they are very much close with the members, the leadership. So it is very critical for the capitals and the board to be engaged, the board of those MDBs to be engaged in pushing and making the leadership and the management of the MDBs to be accountable for pushing the collaboration with other MDBs. And I think that's the only way you can get meaningful results. Otherwise, I think if you leave it that way, it's very sort of unlikely that you would be getting something. Even if you get it, I think it would depend on the sitting head of the MDBs. And as soon as that sitting head of the MDB would be leaving, then chances are any sort of momentum that he or she would have created would be stopped by the successor. So I think it's important to move forward in this direction. And I think if we do so, we would be able to have them work together as a system to really mobilize the funding needed to achieve the those goals that the triple agendas have set for MDBs. This is where I stop, and I look forward to the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have made progress in timing. We do not have any specific question now. Hopefully we'll handle all questions that arise during the second Q&A. So I recommend that we move right away to the next panel, which is on the private sector capital option. Our speakers today are Chris Clubb, who is the head of Convergence Capital, and Junaid Ahmed. Oh.
I'm sorry, Iyabo, I just started sharing my screen, that's all.
Okay. So we will have Chris lay out the issues, and Junaid Ahmed, the Vice President of Operations at the Mega World Bank Group, will then follow, give us some perspectives of the issues from the point of view of the World Bank Group. Thank you. Chris.
Hi, Iyabo. Can you hear me well? Is that correct?
Sure.
And the screen is projecting? Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Clubb. I'm from Convergence Blended Finance, and I'm really going to focus on a part of really what Convergence, and I think most of us are dedicated to, and that's really increasing in a systemic way the amount of SDG and climate investment in the low and middle income countries to achieve the SDGs and Paris Agreement. So in September, our colleagues at UNCTAD just actually released, what is their best estimate as to what the current investment gap is for the SDGs. Their best guess is it's around $4 trillion a year of investment. They've tried to quantify it by sector. Now, one of the benefits we actually have in the development community is the actual sectors where the largest gaps exist are actually sectors which primarily are funded by the private sector in developed countries. So investors in developed countries are used to investing the types of projects and sectors and the SDGs where the biggest gaps lie. So for example, energy, water and sanitation, infrastructure, food and agriculture. Now, one of the problems we actually have, if you look at the World Bank international debt statistics, and you look at the actual level of FDI and portfolio investment and debt investment flowing into the low and middle income countries, once we exclude China, we have a challenge, we have a problem. On average, over the last 3 years, we've had net debt flows from the private sector of around 115 billion into these countries once we exclude China. And equity has actually been in a negative position of 19 billion. Now, when you add it all up, it's around 95 billion of net financial commitments cross-border into all low and middle income countries once we exclude China. That, unfortunately for all of us, is equal to around 2% of the SDG and climate investment needs in these countries. We engage all the time with private investors, and really they signal to us primarily, especially the big institutional investors, that the biggest impediment they have, and they all want to be investing more, and there will be a call to action on November 30th from 13 different private investor groups that represent over, I think, over $50 trillion of assets under management, saying they want to invest, they want the MDBs to reform along the lines of here. And if the reforms do happen, they are committing to invest. So keep your fingers crossed as to what this is. But they generally say, look, Chris, I'm sure the projects are great, but the reality is the actual risk that's on offer in low and middle income countries is just beyond our fiduciary and regulatory obligations. And this is a good profile. Unfortunately for us, only 11% of developing countries are rated investment grade, 76% are rated lower. So most of the time investors say to us, Chris, I'm sure the projects are great, we just simply cannot invest. And that's why when we look at our colleagues at the multilateral development banks, the prospects that they have to mobilize significant amounts of private investment in public sector operations and private sector operations is amazing. The prospects, the potential is great. All institutional investors that we talk to want to partner with MDBs and DFIs, want to be mobilized by MDBs and DFIs. But generally speaking, if you look at their numbers that are released every year, when you look at what they call private direct mobilization, they're mobilizing between 20 and 25 billion of private investment in all of their activities. That is equal to, around 2%, or I'm sorry, it's around less than 1% of the MDB and DFI investment requirements. But let's just step back for a moment. If the SDG and climate investment needs are between 4 and 5 trillion, we need to keep in mind that the MDBs, when you look at their annual financial commitments to all countries, it is only around 100 billion right now, or thereabouts. So that is only equal to 2%. So we must always remember that the MDBs are only one of the channels that we have to really boost SDG and climate investment. Even if it can be doubled or tripled, we're still going to be lower than 10% of the SDG investment needs, and probably less than 10% of the gap themselves. This graphic repeats one of the tables from the Capital Adequacy Framework Review. The first 4 or 5 columns. The first 4 columns are just a complete repetition of that. We've engaged a lot with Moody's, S&P, and Fitch to estimate, based on the business models of each of these MDBs, is there an approximate maximum leverage they could have of their capital while maintaining their existing ratings? They tell us they've communicated that relatively transparently to the management teams of the MDBs. They haven't communicated it externally, but it's in there indirectly when you read their actual reports. And on average, they could be holding no more with their existing capital of around $2 trillion of development assets on their balance sheet. That's the maximum that they could possibly hold. Probably less than that, but that's the actual theoretical maximum. And if you divide the average life of 7 to 8 years, the most they can be underwriting or arranging on an annual basis with their own capital is around $230 billion. Okay, now that, once again, is less than 5% of the SDG and climate investment needs in these countries. So if we want the MDBs and DFIs to be significant providers of capital and mobilizers of capital, I think we need to address what Iyabo's asked us to actually look at. What are the main challenges to private capital mobilization? Big picture, the MDBs and the DFIs, from our perspective, do an excellent job of achieving good development impact and climate impact in the projects that they are undertaking. No doubt about it. In our opinion, we also think that ODA is achieving good development impact and climate impact. But when you look at those flows and you look at the governance of these 3 flows, MDBs, DFI, and ODA, generally speaking, there is not a prioritization towards total SDG investment or total mobilization or substantially narrowing this SDG investment gap. And until the MDBs, DFIs, and ODA are governed where total investment and therefore mobilization is important, we don't really think that there is going to be substantial narrowing of that 4 trillion investment gap. And once again, one of the problems we actually have is the level of risk that's been determined. But when we look at MDB and ODA, when it is allocated on an annual basis, Our estimates are that less than 3% of MDB and DFI commitments formally de-risk investment risk in low and middle income countries, and less than 2% of ODA does too. So we have very, very small amounts that are actually creating the risk profiles that will actually be mobilizing private investment. Now, we work with a group of development experts, private investors last year, and we published under the leadership of USAID what we call an action plan for climate and SDG investment mobilization. We estimated that probably if everyone was firing on all cylinders in mobilizing as much as possible and deploying all of their capital on the balance sheet of MDBs and DFIs in good financial additionality, probably the cap is around $530 billion of annual financial commitments that are really being arranged by and or participating in mobilization from the MDBs. So probably with the existing capitalization of these organizations and the existing amounts, with only maybe capping ODA of 3 or 5% for this purposes, the most that can be done is around 530 billion. But if we did this well, and we actually mobilized a lot more into the public sector operations, which currently there's virtually no mobilization happening in public sector operations. It's almost all in the private sector operations. And if we could reduce the interest rates for the sovereign borrowers relative to their capital market cost, our estimation is once we get this up and running, there could be around a $20 billion annual savings of interest expense by the developing countries if we begin to mobilize at the risk that investors would be prepared to invest in. And, you know, Iyabo asked us to think about what would be some of the key performance indicators that we can be kind of thinking about for multilateral development banks. It's clearly in the action plan that we published last year under USAID's leadership. So OECD DAC members, private sector came in and said, what do we think could be realistic? You know, so for example, we think that they need to be definitely increasing their amount of annual commitments and thinking about actively how do we distribute this to prospective investors. Investors are very, very interested in the MDB's sovereign credit risk. They're very, very interested in the private sector debt risk that they're investing in. It's a little less, to be honest with you, in the private sector equity risk that they're originating. But this is a kind of a distribution of what we thought the KPIs are. So this is just a complete cut and paste from that action plan. And Iyabo asked us to ask about what are some of the things that developing countries can do towards mobilization and with financial additionality. So financial additionality today, practiced by most MDBs and DFIs, is just simply binary. Is there enough financial additionality? We're in a place in 2023 where financial additionality can easily be measured on a scale of 1 to 100. When I was at EBRD, we all sat down and measured development impact at EBRD, technically transition impact, on a scale of 1 to 100. So all of us in the staff knew exactly what a high development impact or low development impact is. I would encourage the G24 and developing countries to take leadership on this particular issue. You need to be demonstrating to the MDBs and DFIs, this is what you collectively think is high financial additionality for your commitments. And if that were to be occurred and we could rate this on a low, medium, or high, or 1 to 100 over the course of time, ultimately we would be migrating the MDB and DFI commitments towards much higher levels of financial additionality. So that, Iyabo, I'll just wrap up, and thanks very much for inviting us to participate.
Muted. Okay. Thank you very much for that very succinct presentation. I will now call on Junaid to speak. I think you guys are coming from opposite ends of the same spectrum, so we expect to hear from him the World Bank's perspective on some of these issues. I'm actually very struck that only 2 to 3% of MDB financing is de-risking. Maybe Junaid has a different position on that. Junaid, are you there?
I'm here, Iyabo. Can you hear me? I'm having a little bit
sure.
of... Great, wonderful. Thank you very much. Wonderful to see many colleagues and friends. And Chris, thank you for really setting out one of the challenges that I think the MDB community is facing, which is how do you move or complement being a lending organization to being a leveraging organization? You know, the shift from lending to leveraging or complementing lending with leveraging is a massive shift. It's not as easy as we would hope. But if the ability of MDBs to leverage capital markets and bring private finance into development can really be enhanced, it's really a big game changer. And our president Ajay Banga has made that one of his priorities. In that context, Ajay Banga says something very important. He says his secret weapon is MIGA, except the problem is it's too secret. So let me at least try and answer some of the questions that are being raised about the ability of MDBs to be leveraging entities from the perspective of MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. MIGA was created in 1988, so it is the youngest of the World Bank Group institutions, and it was created with a whopping $366 million into its capital, with $1 billion callable. The $366 million capital has never been recapitalization has been done since 1988 till now. And its job, MIGA's job, is to de-risk the system so that private finance, FDI, and market finance can come into development. The $366 million since 1988 has been converted to $74 billion of guarantees over that time. For every $1 we guarantee, we bring in $16 of private finance. And for every $1 we guarantee, 65 cents we reinsure with market reinsurers. So as an MDB, we are the biggest leveraging entity that exists today. If you look at EIB, which is the next group, it's 1:5. Ours is 1:16. IBRD is about 1:4. IDA is 1:1. So the question is, can we go from being 1:16 and actually move even further? Today, 30% of our guarantees are in sub-Saharan Africa or in fragile conflict areas. Just to give you an example, in the context of Ethiopia today, Ethiopia finally has moved towards creating a private sector telecom operator. Up to now, it's been the monopoly of a state operator, and they've added one more operator, and this time a private operator. MIGA has been able to guarantee $1 billion of equity in today's Ethiopia's private sector telecom operator, with $175 million of capital, which we put on the table to guarantee that $1 billion. That 175 is 75 IDA first loss and $100 million MIGA capital, if you will, as second loss. And wrapping that, we've been able to crowd in $700 million of private reinsurer into Ethiopia. Similarly, if you look at a middle-income country, in Mexico, which has now invested close to $750 million through its major electricity utility in hydro, in renewable energy, we've been able to guarantee $750 million with less than $100 million of capital. This kind of leveraging power of MIGA, the question is, can one see MIGA acting as a if you will, de-risker, not only for the World Bank system, but for the MDB system as a whole? And that's our aspiration. President Banga has given us a challenge of doubling, tripling, quadrupling the level of guarantees that we put on the table. Last fiscal year, we delivered $6.4 billion of guarantees. This fiscal year, we hope to go north of $7.3 billion. This is a big shift over the last several years, where our guarantee per year was around $4.8 billion. Now, what are some of the challenges that we face in de-risking? First of all, we actually have a capital reserve here that we can use. Currently, we could go from our current portfolio of $28 billion to about $50 billion without the need for more capital replenishment, provided we keep the risk profile the same. So clearly, if we look at our risk, if you will, paradigm, can we shift that game to increase the level of guarantees? And here, one of the big challenges we face is the lack of a liquidity facility. What do I mean by that? What you have is we guarantee, for example, a off-taker of renewable energy. So in Egypt, one of the largest renewable energy parks have been created. The private operator refinanced the investment. We guaranteed the offtake by the public sector utility, and our ability to do that guarantee with an EBRD liquidity facility next to it gave their bond rating 6 notches better than Egypt's sovereign rating. Why were we able to do it? Well, very simply, that when we do a political risk insurance, and if there's a call on guarantees, then all the money stops. So a lot of the long-term institutional investors find that too risky a game to enter, that when an arbitration process happens, that all money flows stop. EBRD's liquidity facility enables us during a period of arbitration for money to continue until the arbitral award is given. It's that ability to use our guarantee with a liquidity facility has really given us the ability to de-risk even further. This is one of the big challenges we face, and we're discussing how do you create a liquidity facility to deepen our ability to de-risk. The other story that we're looking into, and this goes to Chris's point, we have a credit enhancement entity, which basically we do credit enhancement of sovereign and sub-sovereign entities. So we are able to de-risk municipalities, we're able to de-risk state-owned enterprises, we're able to de-risk national DFIs, but our credit enhancement instrument is used only in countries that are up to BB minus in its credit rating. Now, if you do that, then you can see that there's a lot of countries that are not able to draw upon our credit enhancement window, but are able to draw on our private risk insurance window. We're now looking at how do you actually create risk mitigant at a project level so that we can pierce the national sovereign rating. And here, President Ajibanga has really made a very big shift. You see, the bank has IFC that does guarantees, IBRD IDA that does guarantees, and MIGA that does guarantees. So from a client's perspective, where do you go to get your guarantee in the context of your operation? What President Banga is doing is bringing the guarantee programs under one roof to give it a real big impact. In the case of what I've just described as a BB minus, you can use the IBRD guarantee as a first loss, and then we can come in as a second loss and go below the BB minus. These are the changes that we are beginning to undertake inside the MDB program. But I have to tell you, 30 years I've been in IBRD IDA, and it's only last year that I moved into MIGA, and it almost felt like I was crossing the Padma River into a new country. The private capital mobilization entity that MIGA is, it's a little engine that really has done an incredible job. To convert 366 million into all 72 to 75 billion dollars of guarantee is incredible. A leveraging power of 1:16. I think the MDB report of G20, the CAF report that is put on the table, gives us significant win to look at our risk paradigm to say, can we do more? But I think the real challenge would be for MIGA to become a supporter of de-risking for the MDB system as a whole. We partner with EBRD, we partner with regional banks, and we want to increase that level of partnership. One final point. I think all of the reports that have come out have been technocratically extremely important. What I find missing in those reports is honest discussion of the political economy of what it takes to make the shifts. These reports have changed the ecosystem of discussion about the role of MDBs, and I think that's very positive. But I think it's also very important for the authors who write these reports to actually unbundle what are the drivers of change and where the political economies of change can happen, because that's the story that needs to be brought in front of the shareholders to show where the challenges are. But I hope that what we are doing in MIGA is the beginning of an agenda that President Ajibanga is leading to really shift an MDB from being just a lending entity to becoming a leveraging organization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very well articulated. And there are one or two questions for you, which we will come back to later in the process. For now, I think we should move on to the final panel so that we can have some time for questions and answers at the end of that. Of course, the last panel, we've talked a lot about increasing financing. Most of the issues addressed in this panel so far have been on the financing side. How do you increase finance so that these challenges can be addressed at scale? This last panel is more focused on the non-financial aspects of MDB reforms. What should their lending operations be like? What about governance? What about country engagement? Should MDBs, should debt dilemma that members face be on the table if they're going to be able to create the kind of financial, the fiscal space that they need to be able to take on even more new or fresh financing? So to speak, this panel are Cecilia Nahon, Executive Director at the World Bank Group, Kevin Gallagher, Director, GDP Center, Boston University, and Richard Kozulrai, Director, Globalization and Development Strategies Division at UNCTAD. Cecilia, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello, very nice to see everybody. Do you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah? Good, excellent. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you really very much for the opportunity to discuss all these issues from a Global South perspective, as you presented in your agenda and in your approach for this meeting. So I would like to focus, in fact, on a few issues that are related with the financial part, but also with the more operational part, at least in my initial comments. I would like to focus specifically and share with you some ideas in a very candid way related with capital. In fact, I would like to discuss a little bit about the scale, the cost, the sources, and the allocation of capital within this all general conversation that we are having here at the MDBs and in particular at the World Bank. Of course, I'm talking in sharing the views of Argentina and of our constituency, because all these issues are issues that in fact are ongoing conversations at the board of the World Bank. So of course, I don't speak for the board, I just speak for our countries. So the first issue that I would really like to highlight is the issue of the importance of scaling up capital for development. I think that the issue of the quantity cannot be out of the table. You know, there's been a very interesting report from the G20 expert panel calling for a tripling of the volume of the amount of the resources that are needed to finance development. And this, of course, involves IDA, which is absolutely critical in this moment, and IBRD when it comes to the World Bank. And the capital adequacy framework measures are very supported and are very important. They're very good ideas that we have been really pushing, and the World Bank has been making progress and in a way, finally engaging in these measures. There's a new proposal of hybrid capital. There's ideas that we fully support of how we can expand more and really leverage more the callable capital. But it's very clear as well, and I think it's been mentioned early in the event, that the general capital increase conversations should be also part of of the conversation and should be on the table. Not only because of the fact that general capital increase is the most powerful tool, you know, that we can leverage these resources by 10, when all the other measures that we're considering, the leverage is much smaller. But it's also because a general capital increase puts in motion a very substantive conversation about the direction, about the targets, about the goals of the institution that is very valuable by itself. It's a negotiating moment. We've been doing this over the last year in a very productive dynamic within the evolution roadmap. But of course, we believe that eventually shareholders, we have to agree to really move on to the new stage. So it's an issue of the volume of capital and the scale. And this is clearly relevant considering the size of the crisis we are facing, which keep deepening every day. The issue of scale of capital is very important. The other issue that I think is absolutely critical, and I really want to emphasize today, is the issue of the cost of capital. With the debt crisis in the making, with over 60% of countries in low-income economies, around 35% of middle-income economies facing severe debt problems, severe risks of default. There's a lot of information there. I think that we cannot underestimate the importance of providing affordable capital for development. Interest rates at the global level keep on rising. And this basically implies that all the debt that we already have with the multilateral development institutions is really going much, much higher every day. Keeping net flows from the Mdbs over the last year and a half has been very, very hard for all our countries, low-income countries, but also middle-income countries, because basically of the higher interest rates. And you know that most of the debt with Mdbs is in a variable interest rate. So this is really creating a strong push to find ways to make the cost of capital for financing development more affordable. And this leads me to the importance of course, keeping grants as very important tools for all either countries, but also for including the discussion that we're currently having on concessionality. Concessionality, you know, yesterday it was approved at the board of the World Bank, a very interesting new tool, new project, new business concept for the World Bank related with Uruguay, that for the first time has a buy down of the interest rate of a project for Uruguay if Uruguay complies with certain targets and with certain very ambitious goals in terms of climate mitigation. And I think this is the kind of projects that we really need to be thinking about. It's about buying down the interest rates. It's about extending the maturities of the projects. It's about making more affordable for countries to really finance their development, because the current levels are just not going to be sustainable. And this, of course, leads to the very important issue of how we're going to create a much more orderly, timely, fair, and in a way efficient sovereign debt restructuring mechanism that is still not a result that the international financial architecture has achieved. We've been discussing a lot about the common framework. There's good news there, but it's clearly, in our view, insufficient for the level of challenge that we have with the high levels of indebtedness. But it's about scale, more resources, it's about cost. And this really gets to a very technical discussion that we're going to be having in the next months about concessionality. We believe, because some colleagues are thinking that concessionality, you know, should be minimum levels of concessionality. We believe that really concessionality has to be a big part of the proposal of the Mdbs to promote countries to really invest more, not only in global public goods, but in general in their financing for development and their strategic discussions. The other component that is very critical, Iyabo, is the issue of the sources of concessionality, you know, and the sources of this additional capital and resources that Mdbs need. I think that as the institutions are moving forward into having more emphasis on their climate portfolios, clearly the climate crisis is impacting all of us. The climate shocks have created significant cost. Yesterday, for example, when we were discussing the project of Uruguay, last year, Uruguay, same for Argentina, we went through the worst drought in a century. In the case of Uruguay, this implied losses of around 2.5% of the GDP. And this is just one case. If you take a look to Latin America, to small island states, all over the global south, I mean, the amount of losses that we're having due to this climate crisis is just really beyond our possibilities. And this calls, I believe, for a very important role of advanced economies to step in to provide the necessary resources for dealing with these very severe climate shocks and very severe climate crisis, not only for mitigation, but in fact, significantly also for adaptation finance. But I'll come back in a minute for that. So I think that the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities, which is a very basic and kind of natural perspective to look at climate within the COP, within the UNFCCC discussions, it's a concept that we should really keep in mind and keep on the table within the Mdbs conversation, because it's an issue of climate justice, but also it's an issue of which countries have the biggest responsibilities, but also the biggest opportunities to provide for resources to address climate challenges and also to address and finance in general sustainable development. You know that the World Bank has agreed. This was one of the good results of Marrakesh. We have validated a new vision of the institution that now it's focusing basically on ending poverty in a livable planet, which involves climate, but also biodiversity, and also basically sustainability in terms of social, economic, environmental sustainability. So our view is that we need more resources, we need at a more affordable rates, but also the sources of concessionality and of the general capital increase have to also reflect these climate justice issues. And we also believe, that the next step that we need to go is to see how we can better integrate and leverage and use all the trust funds and the FIFs with the lending and the pipeline of lending projects of the multilateral development banks. Sometimes these two sources of resources are not very well integrated. We think there's a big room to do. In a way, some sort of cash adequacy for the trust funds and FIFs will be really important. So we can take a look not only at the Mdbs, but in fact with the broader lenses to the development financial architecture in general, considering also that significant resources that are put into trust funds and FIFs could be, in our view, much more efficient, much more better used, with reduced bureaucratic costs and less fragmented. And this is also a comment that I really want to make, because there's some ideas sometimes from countries that a hybrid capital or in general resources that come to the institutions, not through the general capital increase classic, let's say, mechanism, should have some sort of preferencing, should be in a way dedicated to one part of the mission, to one part of the vision. We are of the view that all the resources that come to the institution in all these different tools should really be supporting the whole vision of the institution, the whole mission of the institution. There's very big component in this vision of climate priorities, but there's also a focus on other very important global challenges. You may have read in the DC paper that our governments, in fact, approved, validated, endorsed in the Marrakesh annual meetings, that the World Bank has agreed on supporting and giving really big priority to 8 global challenges. And this is a very good outcome that reflected the different views, the different perspectives, the different concerns of all the different stakeholders and shareholders, because this was mostly a discussion at the board level. So it's about stepping in and delivering more on climate, on biodiversity, also on water, also on energy access. A big part also of the global challenges that we have agreed are related with challenges related with digitalization, with food security, which is an issue of major concern, and also of course, to keeping our focus on poverty alleviation and on human development. So I think that when we look at the new sources of financing, we have to be very mindful in the, for example, hybrid capital, and including the market-based hybrid capital options, that the costs remain the current ones or even better because of what I mentioned in terms of affordability, and also that the allocation of these resources really serve the whole purpose of the institution and are not just fragmented, because this will create really significant problems, we believe, from the operationalization and from the dynamic of the resources. And when it comes to sources, of course, we believe that we really need to keep focusing on mobilizing more public resources and also private resources, as was mentioned before. And that a key issue, an absolutely relevant issue, is how we can put together, how we can create together a new way of public and private resources mobilizing for development. I very much like some ideas that some thinkers like Mariana Mazzucato, for example, Dani Rodrik, have published recently in terms of countries designing and implementing industrial policies in which the public and the private sector work together, because they are also focusing on conditionalities for the private sector support. So yes, we are going to try to share the risk, of the private sector to promote more investments, to promote more focus on development priorities. It's also not only about sharing the risk, it's also about sharing the benefits of these investments and of these resources. And I think this is an area where the Mdbs can have a really key role, because the Mdbs, they work with our countries, they work with our governments, right? They sit down, in particular the IBRD and IRA windows in the case of the bank. They sit down to discuss development, to establish priorities, to work on a national development plans, right? And they also sit with the private sector, in particular IFC, to more coordination between these two conversations and more focus on the outcomes, on development outcomes in which public and private learn new ways to work together. I think that the old model, honestly, of just thinking of the public sector enabling private investments, it's not going to be enough. We really need a deeper engagement with focus on creating public value, with focus on creating development, and with focus on really the private sector working together with the public sector. The pandemic made it absolutely clear that the role of the public sector it's absolutely indispensable, it's essential, it's impossible to replace, even supporting the private sector during moments of crisis. So I think in terms of the sources, how to work together, and we shouldn't overestimate the role of private capital mobilization in such a difficult global environment. So we need to do what it takes, but we also need to keep pushing for more resources and public investments. I think that what the previous speaker, what Miga is doing and President Banga is doing in terms of integrating all the guarantees that are across the different parts of the World Bank Group into one umbrella is really a very important proposal. And this also calls us to a better integration and conversation among all the different sources to really work together, but reminding of each one in its own place. In terms of the allocation, one final comment, Iyabo, I think when it comes to the allocation of these resources, country ownership, country engagement, country demand need to be absolutely reaffirmed and reinforced. It's not, it's the only way that these resources, which in fact create long-term financial responsibilities and debt over client countries, these resources need to be absolutely allocated and prioritized. I think having in mind national development plans, programmatic approaches is something that we favor very much, not only thinking in terms of projects, but also thinking in terms of the programs that the countries are putting and implementing. I think the World Bank, we in the case of Argentina, we have a really good way of establishing our priorities when we sit together with the World Bank. And of course, the bank has, and I sit on the board, I know that as an institution, the World Bank has priorities, criteria, a very strong environmental and social framework. The issue is we need to keep working with the countries, and we do this quite well in the case of Argentina, I must say, because we have a very high level of disbursements of the resources. But we need to really keep working with the countries as MDBs, providing country demand is there, but also being much more agile, much less bureaucratic, reducing and learning on how the environmental and social framework can be implemented, not to block, not to delay, not to postpone investments, but in fact, to be much more agile. And there are a lot of things that can be done to streamline, where you allocate the resources, of course, but how you implement them. And for this, I think that the issue of maintaining a strong ownership is important. There's no way resources can be properly disbursed, properly implemented, properly monitored if countries, national governments in particular, don't have a strong support. So there's no room for additional conditionalities, I believe, in the sense, of the traditional or 1990s conditionality approach. I think we agree on that, but it's important to say. But in fact, to build much less bureaucratic institutions. I think there's a lot of things that it can be done there. I think this is the direction both the board and the president of the bank are willing to go, but we need to move fast because honestly, there's no time to lose. The crisis is hitting seriously on the global south. People are suffering. And I think this is the moment for the MDBs to provide, as I mentioned, capital at scale at an affordable price with a big role of advanced economies jumping in and providing the resources they should. And of course, allocating these to all the different challenges and priorities countries have in alignment, of course, with the institutional priorities of the World Bank, but really listening to countries, considering their priorities, because this is the only way that the resources can be efficiently and effectively implemented for the benefit of our people. Thank you very much, Iyabo.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Very, very strong layout of the issues. I think after the session, we can do a summary of the main points. But before then, we will have Kevin and Richard take the mic and give us their perspective, but would also like to do a very quick round with our main speakers, just in case they have any other issue to add at the end of this particular panel. So Kevin first, Kevin Gallagher.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to participate in the roundtable, Iyabo. I really applaud the G24 for keeping this discussion going, as the MDB reforms continue to be slow and lack the ambition necessary to meet the moment that we're in. So thanks so much for putting this on and asking for me to be on it. However, Iyabo has asked me to talk about what no one else wants to talk about, and that's the role that MDBs have to play in the current global debt dilemma. We haven't heard it sort of loudly so much yet this morning, but we're facing an investment dilemma. According to the independent high-level expert group on climate finance, emerging market and developing countries outside of China, of course, need to mobilize about $2.4 trillion annually between now and 2030 to meet our shared development and climate goals. 1 trillion of that on an annual basis has to be foreign, has to be external to emerging market and developing countries. If this wasn't a major task to begin with, the higher for longer interest rate environment has put the cost of capital at new highs. For the 135 or so developing countries that still have clear access to capital markets, they're facing interest rates somewhere between 7 and 12%. And we estimate that there's upwards of 60 countries with no real sustainable access to capital in a sustainable manner. MDBs therefore have the most important role to play because they can provide longer term, more affordable capital for our collective project and play a role in bending down the cost of capital in the private sector but they also need to play a role in debt relief efforts as well. There's two important things. For those countries that have access to capital markets, it's imperative that MDBs obtain larger balance sheets in order to have a much bigger pool of finance in general and concessional finance in particular, and other tools to provide new financing at lower cost. But number two, for those countries that are in or near debt distress, MDBs have to play a larger role in amplifying the problem and providing a variety of new forms of relief. I'm going to focus more on this point because implicitly all the discussion about expanding the balance sheet and capital increases and so forth will allow the banks to be more nimble, lower down the cost of capital, and provide more affordable capital. But let me say one thing about scale before I move into the debt relief component. First, I just want to echo and fully endorse what others have said, Nancy, Chris, everybody, that that the CAF is important. CAF recommendations are important, and I endorse them. But they're no substitute. They need to be complements to capital increases at MDBs. Not only does that get the MDBs to proper scale, but if done correctly, it increases the voice and representation of emerging market and developing countries, which obviously is another major piece of reform that needs to happen across the board at the MDBs. In addition to some of the SDR-backed options that we've heard, I just want to put on the table, and I'll put it in the chat, that my colleague Marina Zucker-Marquez and I have proposed something what we call sustainable future bonds, where MDBs issue fixed income instruments that are purchased by central banks with room to do so, that are converted to equity in a perpetual manner. Many central banks are buying these kind of bonds already, and flipping them to equity would not only expand the balance sheets of MDBs, but also create a fresh asset for central banks. We estimate that if central banks deploy only 0.5% of their total foreign reserves for sustainable future bonds, that at least 60 billion per year in fresh capital to MDBs could be mobilized. In so doing, MDBs would be able to issue more plain vanilla bonds, and their loan portfolio could reach more than 2.5 trillion by 2030. I'll put that report in the chat. I should also note that I'm just back from China's Belt Road Forum, where they opened up two new windows at $50 billion apiece in its two development banks, and they increased the capital. They did a capital increase for their Silk Road Fund, or their IFC equivalent. And to couple that, they created a green project pipeline facility to match the new financing with sustainable development. But let me get to what Iyabo really wanted me to talk about, and that's that the inconvenient truth is that MDBs also have to play a role in debt relief right now. There's upwards of 60 countries that are at or near debt distress, and among those, private bondholders and MDBs are the two largest creditor classes at 29 and 28% respectively, followed by China at 10% and the Paris Club at 8%. In Marrakesh, we started to see some positive movement on this, especially in the form of thought leadership. Whereas the IMF was at pains in Marrakesh to say that there's not really anything to worry about, the World Bank president really loudly acknowledged how debt distress was hurting development prospects. And moreover, the World Bank chief economist was in multiple fora in Marrakesh saying that we need a HIPC-like initiative to meet the moment. It's not that the IMF necessarily has its economics wrong, but their dependent variable is sort of different, right? They're focused on, are we going to have a systemic crisis, whereas the World Bank has a development mandate and therefore sees the situation differently. As UNCTAD in their new trade and development report calculates, 3.3 billion people in the world right now are living in a country that's spending more on external debt relief than they are on education, health, and investment. The other thing that the MDBs need some credit for that we've heard a lot about in 2023, and that's that the World Bank is now joining the ranks of the IDB to put in place debt pause clauses. MDBs should have played a key role in the DSSI, but they refused to participate along with the private sector. The DSSI should be renewed and MDBs should play a role. And in articulating pause clauses for future loans, it's important to eventually move beyond just LICs, but also look at SIDS in other vulnerable countries. But MDBs haven't played a role in the common framework, despite the fact that the G20 Common Framework explicitly calls for MDBs to develop options to share the burden of debt relief in a manner that, of course, preserves their AAA rating and their preferred credit status. In a recent studies that I'll put in the chat, we identified 27 countries that are at or near debt distress, where MDBs are the largest creditor and where MDB debt is over 50% of all external PPG debt stock. So if all bondholder, China, and Paris Club debt was eradicated or brought down to manageable levels, many of these countries would still be at or near debt distress. Now, it is true that with more concessional and grant funding rather than haircuts, some critical projects could be financed at concessional terms in developing countries. But it's important to bear in mind that lending from MDBs takes a long time to disperse. As World Bank President Ajay Banga said in Marrakesh, and work by folks like Chris Humphrey has been echoing for a long time, that World Bank projects take an average of 27 months before finance is released, and that often it can take more than a decade for the economic benefits to be felt. And even the turbulent debt negotiations in the common framework are faster than that. Moreover, if a country receives new funding from MDBs while in debt distress, it's likely that the net concessional flows will be used to repay other official and private creditors that are not providing net flows. Recent work by the Finance for Development Lab shows that unfortunately that's occurring right now. Net grant flows should still be pursued, but like in the 1990s, the MDBs have to play a role in debt relief itself. That said, the level of haircuts that MDBs should bear is smaller than what the private sector should bear. MDBs in China provide loans with concessionality, which essentially provides an ex-ante form of debt relief, and therefore their ex-post default losses should be lower. Conversely, as we show in a piece yesterday that I'll put in the chat, private bondholders charge for ex-ante default in their high rates, but they don't assume ex-post losses, as we've seen in the Suriname and Zambia cases. We've adapted a formula that adjusts the haircuts for countries based on what we call a fair comparability of treatment, rather than the flat comparability of treatment that's currently considered. In a fair COT that adjusts for the level of ex-ante debt relief from concessionality, we calculate that LICs and SIDS would need to move MDB haircuts at about $10 billion, or $25 billion if haircuts were at the HIPC levels that the World Bank chief economist is saying that we need to move towards. This could be financed through a replenishment of the Debt Relief Trust, which is essentially the World Bank's version of the CCRT. MDBs are not only MDB participation is not only economically pertinent, especially for those 27 countries where that's really all of the action that's causing the debt distress, but it'll also help on the issue that's plaguing debt restructuring the most, and that's the participation of all the creditors. With meaningful participation by MDBs, it might help unlock China's participation. Another proposal that we've proposed to unlock China's participation that the People's Bank of China has endorsed is to deploy Brady bond-like instruments where China's long-term bank loans are converted into bonds with a partial guarantee. This will not only help bring China to the table, but those bonds could be sold on secondary markets and therefore not only help distressed countries get more breathing room, but also ease pressures on creditor balance sheets. And perhaps this could be extended to the private sector to get them more on board and in line as well. Importantly, MDBs have to get back in the game of playing a stronger role in debt sustainability analysis, which for the LIC countries is under review at the IMF right now. DSAs are deeply flawed, and as we know, they provide the starting point for restructuring. They don't anticipate any future shocks, whether it be a flood or a hurricane or an interest rate shock. And importantly, they don't calibrate to the optimal investment needs for development, but rather to the levels of suboptimal resource mobilization and investment that were occurring up until 2019. And finally, despite the fact that every G20 has signed on to Agenda 2030 and ratified the Paris Agreement, the common framework is completely detached from those commitments. This is partly due to the fact that Agenda 2030 blindness of DSAs, but debt restructuring has to be aligned with Agenda 2030, as Cecilia Nahon just said, and she lives in one of these countries where this crisis is not only having a huge impact on people today, but it's setting us up for another series of lost generations into the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kevin. So quickly, let's get to Richard. who would also talk about the UNCTAD perspective on these issues. Richard.
Iyabo, thank you very much. Bit of an enviable task given all the presentations that have covered so much ground over the last hour or so, and I'm not really sure what I can add beyond what has already been presented. I think because you asked the questions in what you circulated, focusing a little bit maybe on what Brazil can do in its role as the head of the G20 is something that we're thinking about. So I'll reflect on that, I think, a little bit in my remarks. I would just pick up something that Cecilia said that I think is really important about the need to think a lot harder about the public-private partnership framing of the various challenges that have been talked about. I mean, I come from a country, the United Kingdom, that has been pondering and playing with the PPP framework for 30 years, since John Majors was Prime Minister, and it's certainly, you're not going to give it a AAA rating. You're not even going to give it a BBB rating. If you're lucky, you'll give it a CCC rating, because in terms of delivering public goods, it's been an absolute disaster. And I think that's something you need to reflect upon when you're framing these issues around the public-private partnership de-risking agenda, because at least as the longest standing experience of that, it hasn't. It's been a complete failure. In terms of the G20 agenda under Brazil seems to have three major priorities. One is inequality, particular focus on food insecurity, but inequality is a theme that they want to highlight, and I think that's something that needs to be brought into the macro financial policy framework a bit more strongly. It's, you know, distributional issues do not get enough attention other than from a kind of political and moral perspective. They have profound economic consequences, most of which are detrimental in terms of growth prospects in developing countries. And I think bringing in the inequality dimension much more strongly into the macro framework is absolutely critical. So I do hope that Brazil will be focusing on that issue. Of course, the climate finance issue, Brazil has quite clearly signaled as being key to its presidency of the G20. I think, interestingly, they seem to be framing that, I think, rightly around the kind of just transition framework. So having a much more holistic perspective on the climate financing challenge, linking it to their own concerns about structural transformation more generally, you know, making sure that the SDGs are brought in properly, not just a kind of narrow Paris Agreement framework. And I think that's a very important part of the agenda that I hope Brazil will pick up and extend seriously. The last issue is the one that you've been talking about today in terms of overall reform of the global financial architecture, and lots have been said already about that. In terms of issues that I think we would like to see brought in a little bit more forcefully into that discussion, the issue of global policy risks does not get attention sufficiently, I think. You know, the IMF and the World Bank, I mean, there was a set of very basic principles on which these institutions were established. One of them was ensuring that the kind of beggar my neighbor policies that had wrecked economies in the 1930s would not be repeated. And quite sadly, we're in a world where beggar my neighbor policies are now part of the the global policy landscape, to the detriment of developing countries, hiking up interest rates to curtail inflation, particularly when that inflation is generated from the supply side of the economy, which is the case for most inflations in the advanced world, is having a profoundly negative impact on macro financial possibilities in developing countries through cost of borrowing, exchange rate movements, etc. And I think the need for a much more effective monitoring and ultimately coordination of the the macro policies of advanced economies, particularly systemically important advanced economies, is critical and is not being done properly, at least from our perspective at the moment. So that whole focus on global policy risks, I think, has got to be central to the analysis. For us, and Kevin's raked over that discussion much more effectively than I can. The issue of debt has to be up front and center in this story. The G20 options have been welcomed, including by us, but clearly are not sufficient. Kevin pointed to the weaknesses of the common framework and of the debt sustainability analysis. UNCTAD is attempting to do an alternative debt sustainability analysis that brings in some of the issues that he raised as being missing from more conventional efforts in that respect, and that's work that's ongoing here in UNCTAD. We, of course, and it's no secret, we continue to argue that the absence of appropriate rules and mechanisms to ensure that debt relief for countries that enter distress or default is done in a swift, fair, and efficient manner can only take place again with some sort of sovereign debt workout mechanism of some kind. And that continues to be a huge hole in the financial architecture. And I don't, at least the analysis that we've done, for most developing countries, the sustainable development goals are simply undeliverable under the weight of debt that they currently experience. And so that hope of achieving something by 2030 is off the agenda for many developing countries. And some sort of more systemic approach along the lines of a sovereign debt workout mechanism we see as essential if we're going to be serious about meeting the commitments of the 2030 agenda and the Paris Agreement. I mean, there are some there are some halfway measures that, at least in UNCTAD, we are promoting. One, of course, is the notion of it's a soft law notion of principles of responsible lending and borrowing. That's something that UNCTAD developed after the global financial crisis. I think there's still room in the system for pushing those kinds of principles. They did have some uptake in 2014, 2015 in the General Assembly. Argentina, as Cecilia knows, was instrumental in that respect. They didn't get the impetus that we had hoped, but I think revisiting those principles, I think, is a valuable part of rethinking the debt architecture. I think one thing, again, the second thing that we've tried to emphasize is the value of developing countries getting together amongst themselves to discuss the problem, some sort of South-South coordinating framework. To share lessons, experiences, knowledge on how you deal with this kind of problem if you do enter a period of debt distress or default. I think it's very valuable for developing countries to be able to talk through those problems amongst themselves without the kinds of pressures that come from operating within the multilateral environment. Is something that there's no real platform of that nature currently existing, and I think that's unfortunate. And I think establishing that kind of platform, maybe the G24 could be such an environment for a platform for that would be a positive step forward. So there's a couple of things that I didn't hear in the discussions, which kind of surprised me because they're on the agenda, and I don't know if people have views about them, but they are under discussion. One is the role of lending in domestic currencies. That's something that the new development bank has explored and is thinking hard about, and I think merits some discussion in this kind of context. And I don't know if people have views about the difficulties in moving in that direction and the challenges that it might pose. But I think that's something that needs to be discussed, and the issue of exchange rate hedging. Yeah. And creating some sort of mechanism that can deal with the real dangers that developing countries face as their problems are compounded by exchange rate collapses, I think, and whether that some sort of hedging mechanism can be located in the Mdbs, I think, is a issue we raised a while ago in one of our trade and development reports, and I think it's still a pending issue. The Bridgetown Initiative obviously itself came out with a possible way of handling that problem, but it's certainly one that hasn't gone away in the period since the COVID-19 shock, and it's one that I think merits a bit more attention. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. And on that very last note, yes, indeed, I think that's missing in the discussion, but it's something that we expect to follow up on when we eventually do the policy note relating to this. To save time, we're well outside the time limit. So what I would like to do now is to give an opportunity for our speakers to raise issues that they may want to do another round or respond to some of the issues that have been flagged in the chat box. And I hope we can keep that very, very, very short, very, very short interventions. And after that, we can wrap up. There may or may not be enough time for a wrap up from me, but we will be publishing a note on this session that will address all the issues that have been raised. So if I can start with the people on panel 1, if there's any issue, Chris, any issue you want to respond to or you want to talk about, and then we can go around just like that.
No, thank you. I'll pass the mic. It was a great session, and I appreciate it, but I'll let others take over.
Okay. Nancy?
Thanks so much. And I just wanted to congratulate you all of the speakers and the organization, Iyabo, of this discussion. I found it, I participated in a lot of these discussions, but I found it one of the most substantive, creative, and useful discussions. And I really do hope you'll be able to post it online, because I certainly will share it with a lot of people. I'm just going to say one word about private mobilization, which is something that the Independent Experts Group report covered. And it basically, you can sort of bucket the reforms that were advocated in that report on mobilization in 3 buckets. One is what you might call the whole of bank approach, this whole notion of bringing the sovereign and non-sovereign tools together to work on the investment climate, including sectoral climate, as well as the quality of projects and the development impact of the projects. Second, changing the mix of instruments toward more subordinated, more risk-tolerant instruments, including FX management tools, but also more early-stage tools, more subordinated debt, more equity, more first loss. And the third is to be operating at the portfolio level rather than to try to do all this blending at the transaction level. So I just want to make the point that MDBs are uniquely constituted to be able to do that, because they have risk mitigation tools on the sovereign side that can offset some of the additional risks that the institutions will bear if they shift more into subordinated products. So they aren't filling the market gaps they need to now. They've got to shift into higher risk instruments, but they can afford to do that because they can, on the risk mitigation side, operate effectively if they can bring their houses together. And certainly, Junaid's presentation on MIGA shows how powerful the integration of MIGA into this mix would be. So thanks so much. And I just want to agree on much of what Kevin said on the debt side. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Otaviano?
Yes, same here. I guess the roadmap has been aptly covered, and I like it particularly the emphasis on the way by which, as Nancy reserved, as well as Junaid, on using more the possibilities that we have, like MIGA, and so to expand the reach of what we can do in terms of ramping up the level of financing without jeopardizing the risk conditions of these institutions. Thank you all for the organization of this very useful and comprehensive panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Annalisa?
Thank you very much. It was a fantastic session. Two quick points. I'm really glad that Cecilia brought up the point around the better bank. That was the point we weren't able to kind of discuss in the kind of session, and particularly keeping the focus on streamlining processes. I mean, of course, very much kind of welcome the objective of cutting by 1/3 the project approval times for the World Bank, but that should be across the MDBs, and that's a particular kind of demand that we learned across many client countries in a large-scale client survey that we ran a couple of years ago, and I had the pleasure of presenting in another G24 session. But we shouldn't forget, beyond finances and processes, also the knowledge function of the World Bank and the multilateral development banks. They're part of the evolution roadmap, but it needs a bit overall. Again, not the part where the MDBs and the World Bank will really score highly in the client survey that we ran. We need to have technical assistance and policy advice that has long-term impact, is sustainable, and also the way knowledge is generated, it should be much more at the local level and taking into account the local context, again, for sustainability. But again, thank you for the fantastic conversation, and I'll stop here.
Thank you. Marilou? And let's be quite brief going forward. Yeah.
One question. I think one of the most difficult parts of the agenda is scaling up private sector, crowding in of the private sector, and the role of the MDB. So MIGA is one of the more prominent recommendations in that part of the report. So, and I have long suspected that MIGA had not had a capital increase since its creation. So, and I guess my question to Junaid, not that he's here to answer it, is the limits of that of expanding MIGA without doing anything about the capital base, and what would it take, and what are the particular issues that MIGA will face if they actually go to their shareholders and ask for a capital increase. It has a very different shareholding structure than, say, the IBRD part of the World Bank. So anyway, but thank you very much. Congratulations for a very, very interesting session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Daouda.
Well, thank you very much, Iyabo. I don't have much to add to what other speakers have already said and to what I said earlier. I just want to thank you and congratulate the G24 for organizing this very insightful discussion, and look forward to participating in follow-up discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. And Cecilia? Oh, no. Before Cecilia, Chris, that's panel 3.
Listen, Iyabo and the G24, thanks very much for this. Since this is a G24 session, what I would suggest is, it certainly seems as if quote-unquote MDB reform is going to happen in the next period of time. I think it should happen in a way that is most beneficial for developing countries. I highly encourage G24, and maybe reach out to some of us, to determine really, from an advocacy perspective, what are the best reforms that are of the highest advantage to developing countries. And in my area, private investment mobilization, I must admit it's a secondary or tertiary activity now. If we go through these reforms and it's a secondary or tertiary activity, we'll get nowhere close to kind of getting the level of investment to achieve the SDGs. So it'll be a lost opportunity. There's been 1,000 cases, examples of the last 10 years of blended finance. Lots of it's bad blended finance. What are the best solutions that we've seen to mobilize investment into individual projects? How do we make individual projects more viable and investable? And then most of the money is going to be coming on a portfolio basis. How do we get most money from institutional investors in the cross-border into the most efficient portfolios? That, quite frankly, there's no agreement amongst the MDBs and DFIs on that, on individual projects or portfolio. I'd suggest to the G24 that this is an area that you could work at to really identify what are the handful of best solutions at a project level and a portfolio level, and try and champion those within the reforms that are unfolding.
Thank you very much. And of course, we will take that up. Now, Junaid has left, so let's hear from Cecilia now. Yes.
Thank you again, Iyabo, and really interesting conversation. Let me pick on a few issues. The first one, as you know, part of the reform of the bank included revising the corporate scorecard of the institution. And this is an ongoing discussion. And many countries, including our chair, have been really pushing for the issue of inequality being at the top of the indicators that the World Bank follows and measures and really evaluates to consider its impact. Richard mentioned this. We really hope that Brazil can also be a champion on this issue. We spend a lot of time monitoring and measuring poverty. That's very important for sure. We also need to do more looking at wealth and how the wealth is distributed and how the wealth is really being concentrated, because this is at the core of the lack of development in many of our societies. There's a significant amount of research on that, the relation between growing inequality and less sustainable growth in the advanced economies and also in the global south. The second topic, very quickly, I think that investment more in adaptation finance is absolutely relevant. You know, at the global level, only 33% of climate finance goes to adaptation projects. And for some countries in the global south, adapting to climate shocks, adapting to this environment of really climate crisis is absolutely an urgent priority. So my main point is we should avoid one-size-fits-all approaches for climate. Some countries have a big role in generating emissions and need to prioritize mitigation reduction. Some other countries really need to prioritize adaptation to climate shocks in their funding. And there's a big role for Mdbs there because the private sector is not really financing so much adaptation finance. And my last point, I really think the G24 is a key partner at this discussion. I really hope we can continue exchanging with colleagues, including on the most operational issues, you know, of agility, of efficiency, because we all deal with Mdbs. Our capitals deal with Mdbs. And I really hope we can share more experiences of what we can change for the better in the operational models of the institution. Thank you very much, Iyabo. This was great.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, Kevin and then Richard, maybe 30 seconds each, if you can.
Kevin's gone, so I guess I get a minute, right?
Okay.
I don't need a minute. I should have commended Kevin for a point that I don't think gets enough attention, which is the recognition that we have an investment crisis in many developing countries. Once you take China and India out of the figures, it's a very serious problem that doesn't get in, and that's public and private, and that's an issue I think that needs to be further explored. Just to thank you, Iyabo, for putting this together. It was an excellent event, and I guess I'll see you in Geneva next week.
Thank you. Sure. So, what we're going to do, instead of going through a kind of a wrap up from me, we'll distribute the summary of proceedings because we're quite conscious that we've taken quite a lot of people's time already. So thank you all for being part of today's event. When I said that we wanted to have an MDB reform seminar, and one or two people said, oh, you know, that issue has been overflogged. Why would you want to have another MDB reform seminar? And I said, well, you know what Albert Einstein said when he was asked why he keeps asking the same questions, the same exam questions year in, year out. And he said, well, the questions remain the same, but the answers change. And based on what I have heard today, it's like a lot of new things, a lot of issues that are coming up day by day. And so we plan to keep the engagement going and also gather the kind of information that that feeds into our work, into our technical working group and into our communique in the spring meetings and beyond. So with that, I will now call on Neil, our bureau chair, to just say a one or two sentences of farewell. Thank you all.
Yes, thank you, Iyabo. Just really very quick, just to thank all our resource persons and our resource persons, our panelists, and everyone who has participated for this event. It has been very insightful discussions, and we'll definitely take these the insights with us in our in our dealings with our multilateral institutions, and also in our future discussions. So we do look forward to continuing the efforts, to continuing discussions, and in particular for the technical working group that we're planning for in Manila by early next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Neil and Iyabo. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.